Good to see everyone here for our first drive-in worship service. Good to see all those joining us at home online. Now next Sunday, our plan is to stream things live from here. So we'll be online and in the drive-in worship all at the same time. So we'll be together in a little bit different way then too. You know, we've had months of this struggle and isolation. And it's encouraging to at least see some faces now. And I hope you've also been encouraged as we've looked at 1 Peter. 1 Peter, he's writing to a church that is struggling, that's going through difficulty. And I think we could relate to that here today, going through some kind of struggle and difficulty. So I hope you found an encouragement as we read these words from 1 Peter. And we're going to continue with this study. And we're going to start now in verse 13. And actually we're going to read from verse 13 all the way to verse 22. And this is a long context. I think sometimes what we do is we take a verse out here or there, we forget to look at it in its context. And I think this passage, which has a lot of things to say, in its context really has an encouraging message for us this morning. And so let's begin reading now, chapter 3, verse 13. Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. And keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. For it is better if God should will it so that you suffer for doing what is right rather than for doing what is wrong. For Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit. In which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who once were disobedient, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers have been subjected to him. Now there in verse 13, I hope you can catch the irony in that phrase, the paradox here. Listen to this, verse 13. Who is there to harm you? If you are reading this in the first century, just about everybody is out to harm you. You are being put on trial. You are being persecuted. You're being persecuted by the government. You're being persecuted by the religious folks around you. You're being persecuted by Judaism. And not only are those the struggles without, but they're the struggles within that we all experience. The struggles within the church of dealing with one another. The struggles that go on within myself as I struggle to deal with myself and my fallen nature, trying to become more like Jesus. I mean, who is there to harm you? Well, who's not there to harm them? It's normal. It's normal for Christians to be hated. Jesus said, if they persecuted me, they will, what? They'll persecute you. In Matthew, the 24th chapter, in verse 9, Jesus says, then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. In 1 Peter 4, just a few passages later, in verse 12, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. That's the normal. We ask ourselves, when are we ever going to get to the new normal, whatever that looks like? Well, this has been the normal for a lot of people for a long time, going through struggles and isolations and suffering. If we ask that question for us today in the United States, who is there to harm you? We have it pretty easy. There's very few people that are challenging us. If we want to have a drive-in church, that's fine. We want to do it online, that's fine. We want to meet inside, that's fine. No one's going to really challenge us. We have it pretty easy. Now you have to realize, though, in the last century, Christians around the world have been more persecuted than perhaps at any time in history. It's just that we're at ease. And the one thing that does happen when we are challenged is our true colors are going to come out. We're going to have a distinction between those who are just social Christians and those who really have come to God with their heart intent on living for Him. Now, there are a lot of complex topics that are in this short section. And so let me just get to the conclusion first. Let me just start with the conclusion. Let me just give you an overview of what he's talking about. He's talking about here to keep focused during our suffering. Sanctify Christ in our heart. Keep focused. Set Christ apart. Keep focused on Him. And the reason for that is Jesus endured the cross. Why? Because He realized the importance of the cross. He realized the importance of what He was doing, and He was vindicated by the resurrection. The resurrection vindicated all that Jesus went through. What He went through was good. And then He's going to come down here at the end of the section and talk about Noah. Noah endured suffering. For 120 years he preached without one response. And that's pretty rough. Everybody ignored him for over 100 years. His family was converted, but everybody else, they just ignored him. But Noah recognized the importance of what he was doing. He realized that the human race was going to continue through him. And all of us are here today because Noah was a righteous man who never gave up. And Noah was vindicated by the flood. When the deluge came, he was vindicated for what he had done. And what Peter is trying to tell us is that we, like Jesus and like Noah, if we realize the importance of what we're doing, realize the importance of our life, we will be vindicated too. We'll be vindicated because of the resurrection of Jesus. And so, this section here, like all of 1 Peter, is trust God in the midst of all your struggle. That'd be a good theme for 1 Peter. Trust in God in the midst of whatever you're going through. In chapter 4, verses 7 through 11, you have this great summarization of the section. He says, the end of all things is near. Therefore, be of sound judgment and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaint. As each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Whoever speaks is to do so as one who is speaking the utterances of God. Whoever serves is to do so as one who is serving by the strength which God supplies. So that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. Paul says the same thing in Romans 8th chapter, and he says it maybe in a clearer fashion, and we're more familiar with Romans 8. Romans 8:18, Paul says, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. Paul is saying we'll be vindicated by all these things we're going through. And so, as you go through the rest of this text in 1 Peter, there's a lot of ifs. I don't know if you noticed that there's a lot of ifs. There's always a lot of ifs in life, aren't there? And he gives these ifs in verse 13. Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? There's not a certainty here. We've got to be ready for whatever is going to come our way, because you're going to have no control over it. There's none of us that have control over this COVID pandemic. And none of us are going to have control over whatever persecutions or trials that are going to come our way. In fact, there's a mystery somewhat of what problems come our way just because we're part of the human race, and what problems come our way because we've just behaved so badly we've brought it on ourselves. Like some of you, I've been doing some binge watching on TV lately, and there's a lot of religious shows out there. I'm surprised at how many religious shows where the main character is a priest or a preacher or a Christian. But one of the challenges for me is the commentary that keeps coming through these shows is, well, if things are going bad, I'm going to lose my faith because God is not there anymore. That's just not true. God is there with us through the trials and through the sufferings that we're going through. And so he says that who's there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? And what's good? What is good? In Romans, the 8th chapter again, with Paul, Romans 8:28. I remember this so well because this is JT's favorite. JT McClung's favorite verse was this, and he quoted all the time. And we know that that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Good. So what is good? Well, Paul gives us the answer in verse 29. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. What is good is becoming transformed into the image of Jesus. Being conformed to that image, becoming like Jesus. So when Peter says, who is there to harm you if you be zealous for what is good? If you are acting like Jesus, if you're trying to imitate Jesus in your life, who is there to harm you? And then you have another if in verse 14. But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. There's an if too. Because not everybody's going to suffer. Not everyone is going to go through trials in the same way. And the if here is more like, if it happens to happen, even if it happens to happen that you suffer for doing what is good, you're blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled. Were the Old Testament prophets persecuted, or were they accepted by everyone? Was Jesus persecuted, or was he accepted? Were the apostles persecuted, or were they accepted? Were the first century Christians persecuted, or were they accepted? Most of them were persecuted, even if they are. Romans 8:31, Paul says it this way: if God is for us, you know the rest, who can be against us? That's what Peter's saying. If God is for us, who is there to harm you if God's for us? Do not fear. But, he says, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. To explain why I'm a Christian, with reverence and gentleness. Not so I can be right and you're wrong. Not that I can prove that you are wrong and I'm right. Not that I can prove that you need to change and I'm okay. But with gentleness and reverence. The word defense is the word apologia. We get our word apology, not apology in a I'm sorry kind of thing, but an apology in giving an answer for something. We get the word apologetics from this. But he's not asking us to give the teleological argument for the existence of God or the cosmological argument for the existence. He's not talking about some of these complex arguments that we get involved in sometimes. He's just saying, be able to at least explain what Christianity is about. Explain why you're a Christian. Be able to let people know why you're living the life that you are living. Do not fear, but sanctify Christ in your heart and be ready to let people know just exactly why you're doing that. There's no reason to fear the world. We have something that they cannot take away. And then in verse 17, there's another if. For it is better if God should will it so that you suffer for doing what is right rather than doing what is wrong. If. And then he starts talking in verse 18, for Christ died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust. Christ died for us. It's substitutionary atonement. He died for us. He died in our place. The core of Christianity is right there. Jesus died in my place. He died for me. He died for you. He died in the flesh, but was raised in the spirit. That's what he says here. There are those today that look at this and say, well, that's just cosmic child abuse. I don't know if you ever heard that phrase, cosmic child abuse. It's been thrown around quite a bit. How could God is a wrathful father who would allow his son to die on the cross like that? That's child abuse. And, sometimes when we're giving table talks, we almost get involved in the same thing. Hey, I don't think I could give my child up for you, and I don't know if I could do this. But God was able to give up his child. And people have had a wrathful, mean dad, and they think, well, God's just like that. He's that wrathful, angry God. But there's more to it than that. Jesus was God. It was not that God was sending somebody else. He was sending himself. He's to the cross. He was God, come in the flesh. You say, well, why does he cry out to God then? Father, if I let this cup pass from me, because there's the human side of Jesus as well. He came in the flesh, but he's raised in the spirit. He is God and he's man at the same time. And there's this odd transition here in this text. He starts talking about Noah. And I think what clicks in his mind is this idea of the Spirit. Well, the Spirit of Christ was there in the time of Noah, preaching to those who are now in prison. We get confused, and there's a lot of things here that are odd and complex in this section, and we could talk about all these things, but we'll just go off one rabbit hole after another. So let me just stick with the main theme here. He's just saying, Jesus preached through Noah back then. In fact, back in 1 Peter chapter 1, he says that the Spirit of Christ spoke to the prophets as they tried to figure out what that Spirit of Christ was telling them to say. The Spirit of Christ was within the prophets. Chapter 1, verses 10 through 12 here. And that same Spirit preached through Noah, and that same Spirit is alive today. That's what he said. The same Spirit is alive today. They rejected the preaching of Noah. They thought it was foolishness. And in contrast to that, we've received the message. We have been baptized. We're not the removal of dirt from our flesh. We were baptized because it meant so much more to us. It was a call to God for a good conscience, for the forgiveness of our sins, because of the resurrection of Jesus. And so Noah was vindicated by what he preached, and we too will be vindicated. And there's this cosmic effect, verse 22. Jesus is now at the right hand of God. He's in heaven after angels, authorities, and powers have been subjected to him. This cosmic victory. It transcends the centuries. That is over all the mysterious, unseen powers in the heavenly places. And doesn't that cause us to kind of scratch your head and say, wow, what is all involved in our universe? There are certainly some mysteries that we still have not had answered for us by God. So he's talking about suffering here, and some of you are dealing with things that we just don't understand. We don't know why you're going through such hard times and what you're going through. I don't know what everybody's going through. I know some of you are going through some really bad struggles right now. And what Peter would say is, stay focused on Jesus. Imitate Christ in your behavior. And in the end, you'll be vindicated. Who is there to harm you? They can harm you now, but in the end, you will certainly be vindicated. Wonderful to see everybody. I hope you're encouraged by the message of Peter. All those online worshiping with us, glad that you're able to join us. God bless you this week, and we'll see you next week.